Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us. I am Robin Reese. I am the Vice President of Communications and Marketing here at Union Theological Seminary. If this is your first time attending a Union event, welcome. We're so appreciative that you've chosen to join us tonight. If you've been with us before, welcome back. I'm pleased to be with you, and I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion about the recently released book, Against the Hounds of Hell, A Life of Howard Thurman. Reviews have called it the definitive biography of Thurman, and another describes it as a masterpiece for understanding this transcendently important figure, one of the most important ministers, theologians, and philosophers of the 20th century. I think we're in for an enlightening and insightful discussion, so let me not delay any further, and I am pleased to introduce our faculty member who is responsible for tonight's event. Dr. Sarah Azaransky is Associate Professor of Social Ethics. She's the author of This Worldwide Struggle, Religion and the International Roots of the Civil Rights Movement, which identifies a network of Black Christian intellectuals and activists who looked abroad, including in other religious traditions, for ideas and practices that could transform American democracy. Another of her publications includes The Dream is Freedom, Pauli Murray and American Democratic Faith. And she is currently working on her next book, a spiritual biography of Bayard Rustin. Sarah?
Thanks so much, Robin. Welcome to everybody, and welcome to this launch and celebration of this fantastic new biography, Against the Hounds of Hell, A Life of Howard Thurman, the first full-length biography of Thurman, published by University of Virginia Press, and UVA Press is offering a discount code to those of you who are here today for 30%, which will drop in the chat. So if you don't yet have the book, please support a university press and take advantage of this fantastic discount. I'm so grateful that you're here with us. Welcome to alums and to community members. Welcome to staff. Welcome to faculty. Welcome to students. And a special hello, and you are welcome to newly admitted students. We're excited that you're here, and we're even more excited to get to meet you next school year. Tonight, we'll be joined by three people. The book's author, Dr. Peter Eisenstadt, is the first person I'll introduce. Dr. Eisenstadt is one of the editors of the indispensable multi-volume The Papers of Howard Thurman. Peter is a New Yorker. He's also editor of the Encyclopedia of New York State, the Encyclopedia of New York City, and he's an executive board member of the New York Academy of History. In my experience, Peter is also an incredibly generous colleague who is happy to share what he knows and to support others' research. And I think you'll get a sense of that esprit today. To engage with Dr. Eisenstadt in conversation, we have the very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who is also Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union. Dean Douglas is also a womanist theologian, author of field-shaping texts, such as Sexuality and the Black Church, A Womanist Perspective, and Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. Dean Douglas is working on a foreword to a new edition of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. Also joining us to engage Dr. Eisenstadt in conversation about Howard Thurman is Reverend Dr. Timothy Adkins-Jones, Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Union, and he directs our new concentration in religion and the Black experience. Like Howard Thurman himself, Dr. Adkins-Jones embodies the best of the Black preacher-scholar tradition. Dr. Adkins-Jones teaches courses at Union like Preaching and Protest, and for the COVID era, Proclamation at a Distance, virtual preaching. He also serves as the pastor of the historic Bethany Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey. Dr. Eisenstadt, Dean Douglas, and Dr. Adkins-Jones will converse for about 40 to 45 minutes with each other, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. To open the conversation, I invite Dean Douglas to ask the first question.
Thank you, Dr. Azaransky, and thank you for the privilege of being in this conversation with Dr. Eisenstadt on this, what is I believe, groundbreaking biography on Howard Thurman. I was so thrilled to get it and even more thrilled to read it, and so much I learned from it. So before we jump in to sort of the heavy understandings and discussions of all that Howard Thurman represents, Dr. Eisenstadt, could you tell us a little bit about Howard Thurman so we have some sort of biography that we can all stand on as a foundation? And after which, tell us why Howard Thurman? What made you decide to write this piece?
Thank you, Kelly. Thurman was born in 1899 and raised in Jim Crow, Florida, poor and Black, and largely fatherless. By dint of ambition, intelligence, and some luck, he achieved his goal of a first-rate education, graduating from Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1923. He believed from an early age that God was best experienced directly out of doors. At the same time, he was a Christian minister and graduated from Rochester Theological Seminary in 1926. And he received and he became, after graduating, a Protestant modernist who rejected what he saw as some of the superstitious practices of traditional church. He was the first significant Black advocate of radical nonviolence. 1935 and 36, he headed a 4-person delegation that included his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, to British India, and the delegation became the first African Americans to meet with the founder of the Indian independence movement, Mahatma Gandhi. He taught at several colleges, sometime at Morehouse. From 1932 to 1944, he was chaplain and dean of chapel at Howard University. In 1944, he left his fairly comfortable position at Howard to become founder of the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco, which was one of the first churches organized on an intentionally interracial and interdenominational basis. In 1949, he published his most influential book, Jesus and Disinherited. The book concerns the plight of the disinherited, society's downtrodden. The central chapters of the book concern fear, deception, and hatred. These are what he called the 3 hounds of hell that torment and distort the lives of the disinherited. And then he described the political and spiritual means of overcoming them. Among the first readers of the book was Martin Luther King Jr., and it remained one of his favorite books and was likely his introduction to the principles of radical nonviolence. Thurman argued with his publisher what to call the book, and at one point he suggested calling it The Hounds of Hell. The publisher said, this sounds like a Sherlock Holmes mystery, and I don't want that. So they wouldn't publish it, but I really liked that title, and I thought I would honor Thurman's suggestion in the title of my book. In 1953, he became professor, dean of chapel at Boston University School of Theology. He retired in 1965 and continued an active book as a speaker and a writer. He published in the end over 20 books. He passed in April 1981. And he was just an innovative thinker and influence, I think, both in the Black Civil Rights Revolution and in American spirituality in the 20th century. And the second part of Kelly's question, I've been working on Thurman on and off since 1995, when I first joined the Thurman Project in Rochester. I certainly never believed a quarter century later I would still be doing it. I joined the Thurman, and I've never found working on Thurman to be narrow or parochial. I started working on Thurman because I needed a job. I had finished working on the Encyclopedia of New York City, as Sarah said. I had done some work on an African-American encyclopedia. And, it started as a job, became a mission, and now it's what Thurman called a track to the water's edge. And, it is my hope that with the publication of the 5 volumes of the Thurman paper, and we should mention Walter Fluke, who was the senior editor of the Thurman papers, with my biography, and there's a spate of work coming out on Thurman. Sarah's work touches on this as well. I think we're beginning to get a full measure of him. I hope he will gain his proper status as one of the most important religious thinkers and philosophers in mid-20th century America. And I think we can talk about that. And if I've, done my work, I've captured just a small part of his passion for a world that is both diverse and undivided.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peter. Tim.
Good evening, everyone. It is a. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter.
So I want to show a few pictures of Thurman, and hopefully I will not mess this up too badly.
And then Tim, you're on. You're on deck.
I'm sorry, Tim.
No problem.
So can you see me? See the Thurman images? This is a headshot of Thurman from the mid-60s. Very distinguished looking. This is his grandmother, Nancy Ambrose, who was born into slavery in Florida around 1843, and I'm screwing this up. This is his mother, Alice Ambrose. This is his yearbook picture, surrounded by dozens of accolades for every award that he won while he was at Morehouse. This is a picture of Sue Bailey Thurman and Gandhi in early 1936. This is a lovely picture of Howard and Sue and some Howard University students around 1940. And this is the family with Olive on the left and Anne on the right. And this is in San Francisco in the late 40s. And this is Thurman as a sage, laughing at one of his jokes, sitting on his desk with his hands put together. And that's just to give a sense of his physical presence.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tim.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you, Peter, for your work. It's an absolutely incredible biography that is helpful in capturing so much of Thurman in one place. And so it will be an incredible teaching tool and something that I really would encourage everyone to grab. And I have to give a shout out to Dr. Fluke, who I believe is with us tonight I see him as a participant tonight. So I have to give him a shout out as the person who really first introduced at length Thurman to me at my time at Boston University. But I wanted to ask, I had a couple questions tonight. I want to begin, both of them actually are centered around what might be perceived as tensions in either Thurman's thought or in his sort of lived experience. In this past year, we've been going through so much, obviously, with battling a pandemic, but also the dual pandemic with the racialized violence as it happens in our country. And with that has been a kind of resurgence in appreciation for and efficacy for and fundraising for HBCUs. Just a couple of weeks ago at the NBA All-Star Game, for example, the entire broadcast was centered around HBCUs and celebrating them and raising money for them, et cetera. Some might say that's an unfortunate side effect of the fight for justice, that while raising money for HBCUs is never an unfortunate thing, but the seeming deflection that can come from supporting educational institutions instead of addressing systemic racism might be deemed as unfortunate. Nevertheless, Thurman seemed to have, to me, and in this particular came out as I was reading Against the Hounds of Hell, a kind of tension between his desire for teaching at and being at HBCUs, or even more largely, his desire to be in Black environments, but then also his desire to build multi-ethnic fellowship, as you see with Church and Fellowship of All Peoples, and really lots of his other work. It's something you say on page 240. He talks about wanting to leave San Francisco because he had a keen anticipation of living in the thought world of Negroes. And so, Peter, I just asked if you could say a bit more about that tension. Maybe it's not a tension at all, but something that I read is a kind of tension between his desire to be in and around Black thought, Black students, Black environments, but also this deeper, profound desire to create multi-ethnic spaces.
I wouldn't say there was any ambivalence about being around Blacks or Black students. There was an ambivalence though about Black institutions. And, I think we need to remember at the time that, for many African Americans, HBCUs was their only educational alternative. They could not go to mainstream colleges. And Thurman always said freedom is a matter of alternatives. And if you did not have an alternative, and if Blacks could only go to Black colleges, if Blacks could only worship in Black churches, and by doing so, they of course were to some extent doing what white America wanted them to do, go to institutions that excluded them, that did not exclude them. And that was the excuse for saying, well, Blacks prefer to go to their own colleges, go to their own churches. Why are you making a problem about this? I think we need to go back to the 1930s. I think, and at Howard University in particular, there are people like Benjamin Mays, E. Franklin Frazier, Ralph Bunche, all of people who are, I think, ideologically close to Thurman, and Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, of course, who was the president of Howard. And one of his favorite sayings is, "We will use segregated institutions to launch a battle against segregated institutions." I think Thurman took this very important course to him at Columbia. I don't know if he went to Union, but at Columbia Summer School in 1922 on reflexive thinking. And he said it was the most important course he ever took. And he said that people at Black colleges are afraid to ask fundamental questions because they're afraid to ask why they are in a segregated institution. And that why segregated institutions exist. So, I think there's a pendulum in Black thought that goes back to the early 19th century between wanting to be full parts of America and wanting to emphasize Black institutions. In the 1930s, I think Thurman and other Black intellectuals were the product of Booker T. Washington's generation of building strong Black institutions, and they just felt it wasn't enough. The pendulum swung another way in the 60s, and I don't know where the pendulum is now in terms of HBCUs, but they occupy a different place in Black society and Black cultures than they did in the 30s. So that would be what I would say. He was never ambivalent about wanting to work with Blacks. I think he always had questions about segregated institutions in a society in which Blacks are not allowed to participate in mainstream institutions.
So we're getting to the beginning to think about then what's shaping his theological and spiritual outlook, of which I know Kelly and Tim have thought a lot about. So Kelly, get us there.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll get us there, but I'm going to lead the way there because I want to follow up on Tim's question. And in fact, Tim, it was like you were in my head. But I want to follow up on that because I think one of the things, Peter, that your biography does is it lets us see the complex whole of Howard Thurman. And there is this complexity there. And it seems to me that when you reading this biography, it's really the first time that I really began to see the way, in so many ways, we talk about the tensions of Thurman, but he lives in this liminal space. And so he's, I don't know if we say torn between, but he's in this liminal space, for instance, between Christianity and the religion of Jesus, between interracialism and integration, between the particular and the universal, and between, and this is what I want to get at, and between Black stereotypes, the stereotypes of Black culture, and an appreciation for Black culture itself. And you see it in one of the first stories that you tell as you frame this biography about his time in India and his hesitancy about singing the spirituals, yet an appreciation for the spirituals. And of course, later in his life, he was a Beethoven and a European classic fan, and is sort of, again, this hesitancy about living into Black stereotypes. So it made me wonder, when I got to the end of your book, and you call it the the Hellhounds, like I've always get the phrase wrong, from Jesus and Disinherited, if he didn't miss one of the Hounds of Hell. And that is, he talks about fear, he talks about deception, he talks about hate, speaking to those things that the disinherited can become a part of them in destructive ways. I'm wondering if perhaps he missed a hound of hell that he exhibits in this liminality, and that is the hound of hell. I don't know the one word for it, but that does not allow one to have pride and in one's self and in one's Blackness, that hound of hell that leads one to think of oneself the way in which a culture does, the oppressive culture does, because he kept running from the stereotypes. So anyway, and that's the thing that I also see functioning in this ambivalence in terms of the Black institution.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting way to look at it. I wouldn't see him as running from Black institutions or Blacks, and I think he continued to speak in, vast numbers of Black churches and communities and things like that. I think he did feel it was part of his mission to speak to whites. But we could talk about that. But the question of stereotype is fascinating, and the question of stereotypes and spirituals is fascinating. I think he was, what they call in the jargon, an anti-essentialist. He did not like generalizations about Black people. He thought generalizations generally were negative, and even when they tried to be positive, like Black people are spiritual or have particular religious sympathies, it was condescending and paternalistic. And he loved the spirituals. He did not like but he did not like the way they were interpreted, certainly by white culture and largely by Black culture as well, as sort of expressing some sort of innate genius, a connection to Africa. I think Thurman as a historian has not been appreciated enough. And what Thurman is saying in the spirituals is the spirituals are not a product of African genius. They're not a product of suffering in a direct way. They're a product of enslaved people trying to transcend their condition and understand it. It was built from the tools that they had at hand. And that you can't reduce it to archetypes and generalizations about Black people. And you need, and you need to remember, and he writes about Black imps and culture, how completely negative and condescending the general image of Black people were in the media and things like that. And, there were two theories about this. Harlem Renaissance said, turn these stereotypes on the head. Let's celebrate Africa, celebrate proud things. He did not agree with that. And he felt that was, you emphasize Africa, in some ways you're apologizing for slavery. And he thought that Black people needed to understand what they'd accomplished. And you can only do that by looking at the concrete historical experience. I mean, I think, was it liminal? I think it was a situation that so many Black intellectuals were in, certainly during his lifetime. And I think today, of having one foot in Black culture and one foot in mainstream society, and knowing you needed to maintain both at the same time, I don't think people would today necessarily quite do the mix the way he did in the 1930s and 40s. But I think the basic problems of white supremacy have not been overcome, and this was his way of dealing with it. I don't know if that answers the question.
So Peter, you just named him an intellectual. Absolutely, of course. But one of the things I think that Thurman gifts us is he's profoundly a practitioner as well, and we need not split those. And so I really want to turn to someone who I know both thinks about this in an intellectual way, but also practice, someone who officiated a wedding today, to help us to uncover some of what Thurman gifts us in terms of practice.
I am so intrigued by Thurman's practice, particularly as it relates to preaching. As a homiletician, thinking about the fact that he was at one point teaching preaching when presumably he didn't think preaching could be taught. And it is that actually leads directly to my question. I'm searching for the actual question here, but it's along the same lines of this sort of tension. So when you have this, what seems to me to be a kind of tension between Black church expression, preaching styles, a kind of disdain for the demonstrative. And his was a theater of subtleties, as you say, Peter, in the book. And I note that tension, but at the same time, he is so beloved by Black preachers and so beloved by Black preachers of the day. I love the story of how Sister King said that Dr. King and others would imitate his style and his deep voice and long pauses. Yet it is not something that has caught on. It is not something that is sort of that is much prevalent in Black preaching today. And so when you combine that with his co-signing of Benjamin Mays' account in the Negro's Church, and the notion from Thurman that Black churches seem to be lacking in everything except vitality, reading that stung. It paints a pretty damning picture of his relationship to the Black church in particular. And so, Peter, I was wondering if you could just say a word about that relationship specifically. We're talking about Black institutions, but thinking about the Black church specifically, to the extent that you can say the Black church. We recognize that is certainly a conversation, but to the extent that you can talk about the Black church, you can just say a word about Thurman's relationship to the Black church, and if you'd like, to Black preaching in particular.
Well, I mean, Thurman was not an institutional guy. He was a member of the National Baptist Convention. He attended some annual meetings, but his heart, I think, was never centered around denominationalism. And, his first position was in Oberlin, Ohio, in a Black Baptist church. But after that, he was at Morehouse and he was at Howard. And I think so it's it's that Benjamin Mays, I think I quote in the book, in 1950 said that the Black church in 2000 will not exist. King said something similar. Thurman said something similar. I'm not sure how much they really believed it. But I think, I think it's the same thing for HCBUs, that he felt Blacks needed an alternative, and they did not have an alternative. And, I think what appealed to him about the Fellowship Church is that it was neither a Black institution or a white institution. And if you're going to overcome segregation in America, you needed to create new institutions that didn't have a history of being dominated by either whites or Blacks. And I think, nobody saw these churches as a substitute for Black churches or white churches for that matter. But I think he felt that he needed to try to create a new type of institution that would really be neutral. And that, and of course the point is, an institution where Blacks and whites and other, people of other races could really meet on the basis of equality. And I don't think he thought you could do that within existing institutions. Certainly when he got to Boston and left Fellowship Church, I think he ended up being disappointed and dismayed the extent to which he was seen as a Black man within a white institutional hierarchy. In terms of his preaching style, it's a very interesting question. I think he was very influenced by Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, whose preaching style also was not, the stereotypical sort of preaching style of the Black preachers. I think he writes about his summer in New York, going to, St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue and being impressed by he believed in perfect English diction. He, and I think for Thurman, and I think the reason why Black and white audiences was so attracted to him, he didn't believe in preaching to people. He wanted to help people discover their own spiritual inner life. He wanted to be soft because he didn't, as I said, he did not like to tell people how to think or what to do. And I think he found a style that was congenial to his message. And he continued to be, as you say, have all sorts of adulation from Black congregations, Black ministers, and I think he had a separate, it's true. One thing I should say is when he spoke to Black audiences, he spoke much more about Black related things than he did to white audiences. There was definitely a difference in the way he spoke to these two audiences. And I think when he was speaking to white audiences, he knew the one thing he couldn't share with the audience and didn't really want to share with the audience is the experience of being Black. It was like, that was something he couldn't explain to them and didn't want to do. For Black audiences it was different, but for Black audiences as well, he never really was like a pulpit thumper and told people what they need to do. For everybody, it was a matter of, you need to discover your inner life and your spiritual, look into yourself. And that is the way to go forward. And I think he believed deeply that social transformation and spiritual transformation go hand in hand. You don't have one without the other. And that there were a lot of people talking about the other part of it. He needed to speak about the spiritual side of social change. And I think he saw that as his most important message, and one that was not being adequately told by others.
Thank you, Peter, for saying the connection between personal spiritual transformation and social transformation. That's something that is familiar here and that we really struggle to enact that intersection. I'm mindful of time, so I want to let everyone know there's a Q&A function down at the bottom of the screen. So when you have a question, please drop it in. And as I'm sitting listening to Peter, I'm watching 4 or 5 different questions cross Kelly's face. So what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to have enough time for Kelly and Tim to have one more, a little back and forth, and then we'll open it up, and I'll be looking in the Q&A for some questions. Thank you all. Thank you, Peter.
Sarah, you know me too well. And each time Peter said something and Tim said something. So I'm going to try to combine 4 or 5 questions, maybe into one.
I yield my time.
No, don't yield your time. Don't yield your time, because your questions are probing and even push further into my questions here. And I'm back to this overall thing of this sort of what I call the liminal space, because even as we talk about Thurman and this desire, if you will, for a time where there would be no white church or be no black church, but this interracialism that he talked about, or his ambivalence in talking about a beloved community, but a beloved community that he talked about, and the experiment in San Francisco with the fellowship. And it seemed to me, and even when we're talking about his tension with Christianity and the religion of Jesus, that there is this tension in Thurman between the just future realities, the transcendent realities, the way things ought to be, and the way things are. And that's what you see in this fellowship church, that he wants this interracial church, but the society we're in is not that. It's integrated, and we can't have that church till we have an interracial society. And he didn't, the disappointments in that. And so I wonder, and Peter, you said it at the end, that he leaned toward the inner, the spiritual. And that to me was like he was leaning toward the way we ought to be. And in the process of that, did that leave him unable, and that might be too strong of a word, but to really appreciate and respond to the messiness of the way things were? I even think of his tension with Black Power, that in so many ways, the Black Power movement was trying to speak to the Black community the way he was trying to speak to the Black community, in terms of finding that source of self-pride that wasn't defined by the gaze of whiteness. Yet he couldn't get there because of he lived up here. I don't want to say that he was so heavenly good that he wasn't so heavenly bound that he wasn't earthly good, but it was that tension that I wondered if he really appreciated the complexity of the earthly that would have to get us to the heavenly, if you will.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and a complicated one. And I think Thurman can be criticized, and certainly was throughout his life, about not dealing with the realities. His head was in the clouds, mystics and things like that. In terms of Black Power, I just like to say one of the most interesting things I found in the book was, yes, in The Search for Common Ground, he has some negative things to say about Black Power. And, being called Uncle Tom's and blackness is a metaphysic. But one of the fascinating things is, among his closest, disciples were Vincent Harding, who was really one of the fathers of Black theology, and whose criticisms of King, after he broke with King in '68, were incredibly caustic. And Lerone Bennett, who was really one of the, from his perch in ebony, was one of the first premier promoters of Black Power. And Derek Bell was another person who idolized Thurman. So the notion that he was, and I think it's often too easy when you look at Black history, Black intellectual history, to categorize people as integrationists or nationalists, or put them in like little cubby holes. And there's no question Thurman believed that Black people needed to be part of American society. But I think his reaction to Black power is in some ways, and the mood of the 70s and late 60s was more complicated than what you get in the final pages of The Search for Common Ground. He wanted to be a part of the change. You know, he was an old man. He was in his 70s by that time. And he didn't want to wear a dashiki. He didn't want to grow his hair long. You know, there were, you know, these cultural things. But I think he tried. I think, you know, Kelly, you know, you're probably correct that he didn't succeed. And I think in some ways, you know, I think the liminality of of being a Black intellectual was as true for him as it was for James Baldwin, and I think it, you know, remains for Black intellectuals today. But I think I would say he tried to connect himself as much as he could to the currents in the 60s. What he hated about aspects of Black power is he did not like separatism. He did not believe that cutting Blacks off from the rest of society would work. You know, there's that wonderful line at the end of The Search for Common Ground: a community that doesn't take things from the outside, feeds on itself and will eat itself and destroy itself. That community was crucial for him, but it had to be a community that was open to outside influences. And I think he felt that some Black power advocates were just cutting themselves off, and this was self-destructive.
And thank you for referencing that book too, which gives us a really key, there's so many wonderful ecological metaphors in that. So the extent to which Thurman is not often remembered enough as an engaging environmentally and writing about the environment. Let's take one more question from our official panel, and then we'll shift to the audience. Tim.
Sure. My last question is actually one that echoes one I actually see in the Q&A. So maybe that will serve as a good transition. And that is, Peter, before we begin, you were speaking of all of the scholarship on Thurman that is in the queue that will be coming out soon, and that really has been coming out over the course of the last few years. And I guess my question from your perspective is why? Why now? Why do you think there's this proliferation of attention to Thurman and Thurman works? And I suppose relatedly, and this is a much broader question, what might Thurman have to say for today? I have to say that in reading, I did not know of Thurman showing up on the FBI radar as a threat. That took me actually completely off guard to read that. It just took me to a different place. But nonetheless, why now? Why now? Why is this proliferation happening now, in your estimation?
Well, if I can pat myself, Walter Fluke, and a few other people on our backs, I think the basis, I mean, the starting point of the new Thurman scholarship are the 5 volumes of the papers of Howard Thurman. One of the oddities about Thurman is that he didn't publish a book until 1945, when he was 45 years old. He didn't publish Jesus and Herod until he was 49. And I think people understandably have read Thurman in terms of his books, and they all come from, you know, the last 2 or 3 decades, the 50s and the 60s, where he published most of his book, and he did not republish any of his earlier essays. And I think if you read those in the correspondence, you see a somewhat different Thurman. You see essays like Relaxation, the Peace Process, The Will to Segregation, The Fascist Masquerade. You first see a more politically engaged Thurman than I think you sometimes see in his later books. Somebody who is more connected with what was going on. And I think, you know, the Thurman papers give a fuller biography. With Head and Heart, is a good biography. I don't know if it's the best biography. It has its strengths and weaknesses, but Thurman was a private man, a reticent man, and he did not like discussing some aspects of his life. And I think in the 5 volumes, and of course my biography comes out of the Thurman papers, there's more in the book than in the project. I think you get a fuller sense of his development, of his politics, of his spirituality. And I think Paul Harvey came out with a nice short biography of Thurman last year. There are, several books coming out this year. So I would like to think, just in practical terms, I think that the papers volume were the catalyst. But I think people have been rediscovering Thurman for a number of reasons. I think there's no one quite like him in mid-20th century America, somebody who was deeply concerned, and if my book had one theme, is I was trying to show as best as I could what it meant for Thurman to be a Black man growing up in America from 1899 to 1981. And the continuities and discontinuities in that. I think Jesus and the Disinherited needs to be recognized as a key statement of American democracy. I think Thurman is sometimes limited when he's just seen as a forerunner of King and just put into the civil rights revolution. And I think this is sort of stereotyping. He's a Black minister, so he's concerned about civil rights, which of course he was, but he's broader than that. And I think, Thurman, the 40th anniversary of Thurman's death is coming up next month. He died in April 1981. And he probably would be dismayed, but not that surprised by the progress in one ways and the lack of progress in others that racial minorities have made in this country and where America has been. And, hopefully it's getting a little better with a new president. And I think he has the unique ability to speak to both practical and spiritual concerns and always insist that they're connected. So, I guess that's why I think people will rediscover Thurman. And I think with my biography and other work, there are more tools out there now for people to get a better sense of Thurman than you can just from reading his books.
Thank you, Peter. A few people have mentioned Dr. Fluke and your Peter's work and a number of other people's work to edit there are 5 volumes of the papers of Howard Washington Thurman. I put a link in the chat through University of South Carolina Press. What the collected volumes are, or its primary source material that are framed and introduced, each letter, each lecture, each set of lecture notes that go through Thurman's entire life. And they really collect and give sort of, if Peter's biography is the beautiful Argyle sock with the pattern, the papers are like the sock turned inside out, all of the strings. So for those Thurman heads out there, go look at the papers. There's a fantastic, I will say as a union professor, there's one of my favorite letters is a letter that he writes to Reinhold Niebuhr inviting him to a party and to serve as a teller. Niebuhr says no, but I'll let you read the letter and the response. It's fabulous.
Yes, no, I agree. No, and if I could just plug one more thing.
Please.
Walter Fluke and I are continuing to publish unpublished sermons of Thurman. The first volume came out of Thurman on moral choices and the prophets last year. We're working on a book that will come out later this year of Thurman on the great mystics. So there is more unpublished Thurman out there and more is being published. And, we scratched the surface, I think, Thurman both as a thinker and what Thurman has to say. So there's more on the way.
Wonderful. And so just to remind everyone to drop a question in the chat. And I'm looking at the questions. Thank you, Tim, for taking on helping to frame one of them. One of the things Peter, somebody asked about mentors. I actually noticed in the comments someone referencing that they know about Howard Thurman because they were a student of Katie Cannon. And so Katie Cannon was a womanist theologian, or womanist ethicist, pardon me, who wrote about Thurman. So you have these different kind of strains of how we know about Thurman. But you've mentioned already today a number of different generations of both his colleagues and then people who he mentored. So can you maybe pick out 2 or 3 people? We were talking about this also ahead of time before we began talking today, but of how we see his influence. So one of the things, I'll sort of frame this a little bit too and say, you know, one of the things that we haven't mentioned and that you describe him as being a proto-feminist. So we wound up talking about and saying a lot of men's names today, but he was forward thinking and in recognizing the full humanity and capacity of women.
He was, you know, and in the book, you know, I talk about his bachelor's thesis at Rochester Theological Seminary, The Basis of Sex Morality, which was a blazingly feminist document, the product of his encounters with the works of Olive Schreiner, the white South African feminist and pacifist, and maybe we don't have time to go into that. Thurman was a great mentor. You know, I think, you know, the first generation of Thurman scholarship, Walter Fluke, Lucius Smith, Mozella, Mitchell, all studied with Thurman. You know, in the last 6 years of his life, I think, from 1975 to 1981, he had a series of seminars in San Francisco. And I think the 3 people I mentioned all attended. They would go for 4 or 5 days. And he would speak and they would listen to tapes, and they all came away as, you know, devoted Thurmanites. His influence went beyond, with broader. One of his most interesting disciples was Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was a Hasidic, neo-Hasidic rabbi and founded what became the Havarah movement, one of the most influential movements in American Judaism in the second half of the 20th century. And Zalman Schachter Shalomi always called Thurman his Black Rebbe. That and it was, you know, very much Thurman's emphasis on direct experience of God, which so many people had been missing from sort of a stultified, sort of formal Jewish experience. You know, that I think he attracted, you know, both men and female disciples. Lerone Bennett somewhere says there's a universe, I quoted toward the end of the book, that there's a university of Thurman, and Thurman's ideas are percolated, I think, in the Black church, in progressive religion generally, and outside, without people necessarily knowing Thurman was behind it. I think Thurman was, you know, he was basically a retiring man. He did not believe in putting himself forward. And I think that one reason why he is obscure, relatively obscure, is he was not a self-promoter. I think the fact that I think Black intellectuals were ignored, I think to some extent in mainstream culture in his lifetime contributed to that as well. But so I think he just influenced generations of people, you know, and everybody who met him spoke about his searching spiritual power. You know, some people have a spiritual aura, and it's clear that Thurman had this from his undergraduate years in Morehouse. People just went to him. You know, Jesse Jackson, who is another Thurman disciple, and another person who's, you know, to go back to Kelly's question, his politics on Black power and things like that were quite different from Thurman's. You know, I said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I know you're Jesse Jackson, but who are you?" And it things of that sort. So on a personal level, it was a matter of, you know, searching spiritual insight. And there are all these stories about, you know, and Thurman complains that, you know, it's like, I guess it's a familiar ministerial complaint. I don't get weekends off. It's 7 days a week. And all these people want to talk to me about their private lives, and it's taking up all of this time, and I'm so overburdened with this and things of that sort. And but on one level, I know he appreciated it, but I think that's it. I think, and for those of us who never got to speak with Thurman, you can get a sense. Both Boston and Emory have listening rooms, and I urge people to listen to Thurman speak, that it's a very different experience from reading him on the page. He was always worried that his words were flat on the page, and they're certainly very different from hearing his expressive way of speaking. So, he can't mentor us directly, but I think you can get a sense of his spiritual uniqueness by reading him and listening to him.
And Peter, one of the pictures, just to talk about the mentoring and sort of also how the kind of nitty gritty every day, that one of the pictures you showed was of him and Sue at Howard. And so he shared a house, like he had a duplex with Ralph Bunche was on the other side. And the Thurmans were always having students through there. There's these stories of always students coming through. And so I think she was also an incredible, she was doing a lot of the hospitality. So we want to talk about him to also, and she was of course brilliant in her own right, but that part of that mentoring is opening the space, is saying to come in and providing a space where conversations are going to happen and those sort of exchanges happen. So all different kinds of, I think.
Yeah, we haven't spoken enough about Sue tonight.
Oh no.
And I don't know if this is the time.
Say a few things about her.
But first I wanted to say, Thurman can be quite introverted. I think he really did not, he had to get himself up for dealing with people. Sue was the extrovert. And so much of the hospitality and the people who became, adopted by Thurman had to do with Sue, I think, more than Howard, who was sort of like, and it was to some extent the traditional, gender role. Thurman was thinking deep thought somewhere, and Sue was taking care of the daughters and taking care of, people coming for dinner. She was a remarkable person. Sue, when Sue and sent the papers to BU, she did not send very many personal papers, unfortunately. And I think Howard would have liked it that way. I think they're both private people. So it's a little difficult to get a sense of their inner life. If somebody wants to write a book about Sue, I think it's a topic out there that needs to be done. And maybe they could find more than we did. I think she was more down to earth, I think, than Howard was, and more practical, and just as impassioned. I think Thurman's basic religious and political worldview were more or less shaped by 1932, when Howard and Sue became a couple and got married. But what always strikes me about her is, there's this transcription of their meeting with Gandhi in 1936. And Sue is always asking the difficult questions. It's like, she asked Gandhi, how come you didn't work with Native Africans during your time in South Africa? And his answer shows that he still thinks Africans are too violent and stuff like that. It's not one of Gandhi's best moments, and I think it really hurt the Satyagraha movement. The notion that he could achieve something for Indians and leave Africans out was, I think, sort of, anyway. That's another. And then there's this, in the discussion, there's this place where they're getting into this airy metaphysical, like what is nonviolence and what does it mean and how do you, and then Sue said, okay, this is fine. What should I do if my brother is lynched? How would I respond to that? And I think that's sort of the role she played in their lives, like bringing him down, making him deal with people on a more regular basis.
Yeah, and also for those of you who have been to Boston and visited the African Meeting House or the Black Freedom Trail, if you go into the National Park Service entryway to the Black Freedom Trail, you'll see this huge, wonderful pull quote painted on the wall from Sue Bailey Thurman. I walked in and I shrieked, and the woman looked at me like I was crazy, because Sue Bailey Thurman was a historian, not a historian in the way that we kind of credential and recognize, but who wrote history all the way through her career. And she was fundamental in preserving that space, and it later on became a national park. So she's someone who was, yeah.
And in Boston, she, as you said, she published histories in San Francisco, histories in Boston. In Boston, she worked with Nathan Huggins, who was incredibly close with the Thurmans, and was, he was the first Du Bois professor of African American studies at Harvard University, was a professional historian as they come, and they worked closely and founded an African American history museum. One thing, that I think I've touched on a little here that is in my book, that Thurman, as a historian, and an influence on historians and historical thinking is an aspect of his thought which I think really has not been sufficiently appreciated.
So I want to make sure that we ask there's a few different ways that this has shown up in the chat, which is basically, thank goodness that we have more about Thurman. Thank goodness that there's more to be written about both Thurmans, both Howard and Sue Bailey Thurman. And what, Peter, as you're in your biography, as you were doing this work, what lessons does Thurman have and Thurman scholarship have for the movement work that we're in today, both in the United States and the extent to which American movements are connected with movements in other parts of the world?
I think I would rather leave that to some extent for other people to answer, and people who are more closely involved with some of these movements than I am. I certainly am not, going to tell, Black Lives Matter advocates what they should do and how they should, what their politics should be. I'll say this again, though, that I think key for Thurman is this connection between social transformation and political transformation. And
can you talk about that a little more? What does that mean? So you just said those phrases, like unpack what that connection is.
And he writes about this very movingly in terms of the civil rights movement, that what the civil rights movement was in the South was Black people in the millions overcoming fear, overcoming their fear, overcoming, the three hounds of hell: fear, deception, and deception meaning that you never were honest with white people, and sometimes not with Black people. You always, controlled what you said. And the most difficult probably maybe is hatred, is like dealing with, an unvarnished, unflinching view of the reality of white power in America, and still saying, I'm an American, I need to work with people like that. And I think that was the challenge. And, we haven't spoken very much today about nonviolence and the way in which he believed this sort of tough Gandhian love could change other people. And I think he believed ultimately the problem with violence was not only that it was violent, but that violence never people are never convinced by coercion. They might go along with coercion if they have to, but they're never convinced by this. And, I think if you look at America today and you look at, our most recent president, who's, no longer in office, that the civil rights movement, the goal of the civil rights movement was to change people's minds and to have people realize that racism is wrong, white supremacy is wrong. And in some ways it worked, in some ways it hasn't worked. And I think, and it's not that I think Thurman would say that violence worked, but I think he would have, what would he say today? That the three hounds of hell of fear, deception, and hatred are still the animating sort of emotional discourses in our culture, and they still need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed politically and legally, and they need to be addressed on a spiritual level, as well as people coming to become aware of their limitations. And I don't know if that's, a clear enough answer, but I think that's what I would say about that.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you, Peter. I want to ask Tim and Kelly if there's anything else you want to underline, if there's anything else you want to flag, if there's anything else you want to make sure to put in the space while we're all here together.
No, I just want to underline my appreciation, one, for your book, The Hounds of Hell, and for Howard Thurman. And I think that one of the things, and you have spoken to it, that I think Howard Thurman really did do very well, and which is why I don't like seeing him sort of cast as pre-Black theology and all that. I think he brings something very much in his own right that we miss. And so that when he talks about Jesus and the disinherited, he's really understanding that he's saying to us that Jesus feels from the inside out what the disinherited feel. Right. And so, he is indeed bringing together sort of the spiritual and the social or the political, but with this focus on the spiritual. And that's the way in which I just think he becomes so significant. There are many ways, but in this instance, so significant and timeless. And I think that Jesus and the disinherited is a timeless piece, because to me, I've looked at it as that a part of those conversations that in this instance, Black parents have to have with their children. And Howard Thurman is having that conversation with those who find themselves with their back against the wall. And he's trying to help people not to define themselves by that wall. And that's, he says, what Jesus helps us to understand. So I just wanted to underline really what I think is the spiritual and theological genius of Howard Thurman that makes him timeless in what he says. And I am so grateful that he is being lifted up in his own right and not always read through the works or the movements of others.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelly. What a benediction. That's a wonderful summation and sending us off to go. If you have not, and you don't have a copy of the book or have not read it, please track it down. UVA Press. They're not in the tournament anymore, but they still publish books. Against the Hounds of Hell, A Life of Howard Thurman. Tim's a basketball fan. He appreciates that. Defending champs, not anymore. And so thank you so much to Kelly. Thank you so much to Peter. You are welcome at Union. I'm sorry you are not here with us physically, but I hope that can happen sooner than later. Thank you to Tim. Thank you to everybody for your fabulous questions and your engagement in the chat, your engagement in the questions. Thank you to Union for hosting the event. Thank you to Robin and Ian for the really smooth, fantastic webinar. Thank you, everybody. And good night and be well.